Hey there, Sheryl Kline here. Today is a very special day. Today we're here with Anu Gupta. Welcome, Anu. I am really extra excited to have this conversation with you today.
I'm so excited to be here too. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and first I want to share how we're connected. We're both connected through the amazing, Raw Goddess. And one thing that the three of us have in common is that we're trying to put some things into the world that really help unlock the best in others. Of course, we're always working on ourselves, but that is kind of our mission. And it's really an honor to have you on as another, like what I call catalyst warrior. In other words, someone out there just fighting for the best, for the best and heart-centered leaders. So thank you so much for coming on. And before we start talking about your area of expertise, which is bias, and as the scrolling ticker says, breaking bias, because we're starting to become more aware now. I wouldn't want to say finally, but clearly we have a long way to go.
Sure.
And it's really refreshing to talk to someone who is like, I am dedicating myself and my career and my company to this. And so someone who is going to help us have strategic change, which in turn, and I can back you by this 100%, and I talk about this in my course, it's best for everyone. It's not just saying this group of people or these groups of people deserve this. It's like, hello, it's good for you too. So I'm really excited to crack open this conversation and then start to understand some concrete things, because sometimes people, me included, get a little overwhelmed. Like, well, what do we do and how can we do it? And can we do it the right way? And if I'm just one person, what can I do? And so I really look forward to those tangible things, because by not taking action, we stand still. And we all know that, in the story of the tortoise and the hare, the tortoise always wins, and we want to make sure that we're making progress and we don't slow down on this very important topic. So before we hop into it, though, I want to ask you a quick question. Is that okay?
Sure. Let's do it.
Yeah. So about your younger self. Now, you look like a pretty young guy still, but roll back the clock even a ways before. As a really young person, let's say between the age of 6 and 12, or, around there, was there anything that really inspired you to greatness, or that really made you feel really awful, so awful to the point where eventually you were like, I'm going to do something about this because it was so horrible for me. I don't want that to happen to anyone else. Because what I'm finding as I've worked with Olympians and business leaders and people that are really shifting and changing and making these huge impacts, is that they've been inspired by something great. And a lot of them have been inspired and taken action on something that was very uncomfortable.
Sure.
And so I'd like to know, can you give us a little peek into the younger Anu and let us know what has inspired you to do this important work?
Absolutely. I mean, well, first of all, thank you again for having me. And I'm so excited to share, my message and my work with more people. And actually, that is exactly the age where this work started. So I spent the first 10 years of my life in India. I was, just in a wonderful, loving family and just went about my day. And issues of bias came up, but not towards me, because we were from a relatively educated upper class background in India. But there's lots of poverty. But then we moved to the US when I was 10 years old, and suddenly the roles switched. Because my parents were immigrants, they were unemployed, we were poor. And not only that, I looked the way I did, I had an accent, I had a name like Anurag. My full name is Anurag, so it's longer than Anu. And suddenly I was the downtrodden one. Suddenly I entered this caste system that I wasn't aware of, and I was the one who didn't belong. And just feeling ashamed of myself because of the way I looked on a daily basis, the way I talked, the way I walked, the way I dressed. And it was very little things. And this is what a lot of us go through, when we're in middle school, when we're in high school. But for me, it became really personal because I had never experienced those things. And also because I came from a different culture, I didn't have any support networks because my family didn't know how to deal with it either, because they had never experienced it. So I think for me, that experience really colored and inspired me to really understand what is bias. Why is it that other good intentioned people who have families who love them or who have friends they care about, why are they doing this to me and other people? And then also noticing how I might have done that to other people before moving to the US, right? Or I didn't care, I was indifferent, right? When it happened to other people. So that's kind of a quick way of thinking about, that immigration status. I think one example really stands out in my experience was right after 9/11. I was a bit older than 12 then, I was 16. I grew up in New York City. And I remember, weeks after 9/11, and of course, it was such a horrific tragedy. And I experienced watching the towers go down. It was traumatic for all of us who are New Yorkers. But being called Osama bin Laden, just in broad daylight on the subway, just walking down the street by my classmates, even in my high school, and just feeling the piercing pain of that. First of all, there's nothing, first of all, I'm not of Arab descent. But even if I was, my family is not Muslim, but even if they were, to use that epithet in a way to really demean my humanity, right? So, and things like that have really kind of continued to happen in that time. And I didn't know how to deal with that. I didn't know who to talk to. Like, we have a lot of awareness around it now. There's so many anti-bullying efforts that have arisen, particularly for children. But in the 90s, much of that didn't exist in the early 2000s. So, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. And I think it's an important point that you bring up in that, and it reminds me of a story that I just read in the New York Times, and I'll connect the dots for you, but it was about Serena Williams. So I couldn't stand in your shoes. So in other words, I didn't experience being called that. So that's something that you carry around with you that I don't understand. And then also the article that was written about Serena Williams, she said early in their career when she and her sister Venus would compete, she could tell at the majors if the crowd was very quiet, then she knew that Venus had won a point. But if the crowd was cheering, then she knew that Venus had lost a point because they were playing in a predominantly white sport. And I have goosebumps I've read that a couple times. And I was like, oh, because so that is something that, the subtleties and, we've had, before we hopped on, we talked, had a little bit of a conversation about emotional tax, meaning in the workplace, what people experience either subtly or not so subtly, especially groups that are highly marginalized, the toll that it takes on them, and how if we haven't walked that path, it's not on our radar. We don't understand. I haven't been called that, and I haven't, and so I'm really excited to have the conversation because I think, as my daughter, I have a daughter who's 20 and she's like, Mom, you got to get more educated. And I feel like I'm doing the things and I think education is important, but I'm excited to have the conversation with you because I think, then once we're educated, we need to understand what do we do? How do we build? One thing that I talk about too, and you're talking about our courses are congruent, but how to be a courageous, ally. So I know the education piece is important. I think we're making some progress there, but I'm excited to hear from you about what do we do with that education. So why don't we hop in and can you tell me a little bit about your company, what it does, and then how we're taking these thoughts and emotions and really turning them into action and positive change?
Absolutely. And I actually want to start with a question for you, and it's just a one-word answer. So share one word describing how you feel about bias in our society today. Just one word.
Unfair, I guess.
Unfair, right? So you said unfair, and if I asked this same question of a group of people, they would probably say something along the lines of sad, disappointed, angry, frustrated, confused. There's a whole spectrum of feelings that people have. So when we're talking about this phenomenon of bias, it's actually a feeling. It's not a thought experiment. And all of us fall differently on how we feel about this. And that's basically what the company does. It's like, I'm someone who, studied this phenomenon, went to like have multiple degrees in understanding the nature of the brain, how bias is created. But inevitably, I realized, even as a lawyer, that even if I change the policies, which people have done, right? We have a lot of amazing anti-discrimination, anti-harassment policies that every company has, yet need for the Me Too movement. There's still a need for the movement for Black lives. Why is that? Despite all these policies, because we get to change our minds. And that's kind of that's my objective, is to really help people break bias so we can create a world where everyone belongs. We belong everywhere. And how do we do that? Like going back to the example you gave with Venus Williams. So because Serena was in the audience, she began noticing that. So a lot of people that are doing it, I'm sure there's some people that are consciously not wanting, Venus to win, but a lot of people have just this idea of what a tennis player is, right? So as a result, they already assumed competency of this particular player based on the color of her skin. And this isn't just that audience. This is all of us. So the research in the last...
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because I want to ask you a question building on that.
Yeah, please.
Either you were saying intentionally or unintentionally, they might be thinking, okay, this is a white sport. She's not fitting into that context and do that. But also, what is it too about the social psychology of one person doing something and then maybe someone else doing it and the herd kind of following along? So it seems like it might be a double whammy.
It is, right? So this is where I basically describe the difference between conscious and unconscious bias. So conscious bias is something that we know about ourselves. So these are known attitudes and beliefs. And you would probably know this because you work in the field of, gender empowerment. So you know that a lot of people actually have these distorted notions of what a woman can accomplish, what a female-bodied person can do. They should be at home, all sorts of like values that are placed upon entire half of humanity even, right?
Yeah,
so those are...
I'm going to jump in again, and I'm really trying not to be rude because I want to hear everything you have to say. But I was really enlightened that there is a gross, and I'm using gross in terms of disgusting and big issue with gender with inequity within our gender, meaning there's so much further marginalization within our gender with women in color, with women of color, and so I want to hear you in your responses and also maybe include that issue and how we can start, elevating women who feel further marginalized.
Sure. So that goes back to the difference between conscious and unconscious bias, right? So a lot of people consciously believe that, Black people or Latino people or South Asian, whatever people of color are inferior. Right? So that's a conscious belief that they're less than, they're less competent, they're less smart, they're whatever stereotype you want to post upon them. That's what happened to me, right? When I gave you my example growing up. But then there are these things called unconscious bias. Unconscious biases are learned habits of thoughts. So these are habits we've learned through our social conditioning. And these habits distort how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So let's do another example, right? I'm going to say a word. Notice the first image that comes to your mind. Yoga teacher.
Say that again.
Science. Yoga teacher.
Oh, okay.
Right? So what is the first image, right, that comes to your mind? You don't have to share it, but does it represent someone who looks like me? Maybe, maybe not. And that's because the way that we've learned how to imagine what a yoga teacher looks like. In fact, I'm actually a trained yoga teacher too, but with that said, that's where we're beginning to see that unconscious biases are these associations. But these associations, unless we make them conscious, are impacting our day-to-day decision-making. Mm-hmm. So going back to the example you gave in terms of the inequity within gender, so women of color, particularly Black women, for example, diet rates 3 to 4 times higher while giving birth than white women. And in New York City, where I live, the numbers are 12 times higher in terms of maternal mortality. What's going on there? I mean, this actually happened to Serena Williams, where she was having a blood clot after giving birth to her baby, and the nurse thought she was just having a headache. So there was that lack of understanding, being able to see, and also not trusting people with what they're experiencing. So this has actually been studied as a phenomenon. It's known as the racial empathy gap, where scientists, what they did was they showed people images of a needle piercing a hand. Now the hand was either light skin or dark skin, and they're basically measuring people's heart rate, sweat glands, pupil dilation, and they saw when the needle was piercing a light-skinned hand, people were more empathetic, their responses. And that's what they call the racial empathy gap. So the solution out of this problem, because we can talk about the problem, and we have been for decades now, is actually that. It's about building empathy and compassion. It's about understanding and imagining the perspectives of other people. So something you'd said earlier that, well, you've never experienced someone call you what people have called me, so you wouldn't know. Actually, the science says otherwise. We as human beings have the capacity to imagine what it's like to be in other people's shoes. This is what actors do all the time. Like, you've probably been to a performance where you literally had goosebumps, even though the actor was just acting someone else's life experience. Yet you could, or you're crying, but you could feel it, right? So all of us have that potential. And that's what we do. That's how we break bias, is to actually retrain the mind, unlearn those old habits of thoughts, and relearn new habits of thoughts that really humanize ourselves as well as each other. And that tool is actually called perspective taking. And it allows us to really break bias.
Yeah, it's good to know. Right before you got to that solution, I was like, oh my, it does tend to be overwhelmingly complicated sometimes. And a lot of times too, let me pose a question back to you. Do you think this also starts with some empathy and compassion towards ourselves? Because it seems like I'm not going to get political, so I'm not going to go there. But it seems like some of the people that are like most horrific, they had an experience in their childhood, and people tend to believe how they're grown up. So it seems like, how do you undo? It's almost like, you really do have to rewire their brain, and it does seem like a big job. And so, what is the first step? So for example, when I talk about building influence, it's about acknowledge and validate. So before you have to share a point of view, you have to, talk to someone and say, it seems like this, and I understand. So it's just laying the foundation. It's the first step, because influence can be a little bit complicated. So if this is still seeming complicated to some of the people listening, or what is something that we can start, like what I call a tiny triumph? So in other words, can we walk down the street, and if we see a person, can we kind of shift our trigger, and start to rewire our brain? Or what is that first little tiny triumph, so we can all start to make that 1 degree of change that can really make a big difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about changing habits and changing behavior, right? So that requires practice. So what we're trying to do is really rewire the brain in that way. And it's actually not a tall order. It takes about 8 weeks of daily practice. If like someone wants a tiny triumph, I think it's really starting with mindfulness, right? And I have a hack for that, which is RAIN. RAIN is an acronym for 4 steps, right? Recognize. So first we need to accept the fact that there are inequalities in our society, recognize them. Yes, like there is a gender pay gap, there is a racial wealth gap. Yes, there are disparities when it comes to, whether it's mass incarceration or healthcare. So we recognize it, but recognition is not important. It's by itself sufficient. We have to acknowledge that it exists, right? So it's not just recognizing yes, 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 but it's like acknowledging that, yes, this is the society I live in. This is the part of the democracy that I'm a part of. And then the latter two are what require more practice, right? Investigate. So investigate, why are things the way they are? And that's what they can do, through courses with me, with you, with anybody, right? There's so much scholarship out there. There's so many people that are working on this. And then the fourth, which is I think the most important thing, is to not personalize. So this isn't, when we're talking about these systemic disparities, whether it's related to the identity of gender identity or sexual orientation or race or ethnicity, it's not personal. We didn't create it, we didn't cause it, but we are responsible for it. So once we've made unconscious conscious, we have an obligation to respond because we are connected to one another. This is about all of us together, rising together, and to really, really live our full potential as human beings.
Yeah, and I think you said something, we said a lot of things that are very important, but one thing you said is that we may not have created it, but we're responsible for it.
Absolutely.
So really shifting that mindset around, well, I'm not a racist person, so that's for other people to deal with, and it absolutely isn't. And that's where I think that courageous allyship too kind of comes in, because, again, we had this pre-conversation before about there's probably a lot of really great people in the workplace that are noticing things, but out of fear or for whatever reason, they're not speaking up. And so being an ally and doing the things that you're saying does require a great bit of courage. And so practicing that can really, really be helpful. But understanding, I think people need to still and also be aware and kind of raise their hand and say, I accept the challenge. And I know that as an ally or as a person who's going to try and shift and change this, it might not be easy.
But the thing is, like, I don't want it to be, it doesn't have to be a struggle. It doesn't even have to be a challenge. It could be playful, right? So part of it is like when we think about the RAIN acronym, when we're not personalizing things, we're just practicing. Like, I don't speak up in a workplace situation or even outside. So let me try this. Okay, I'm going to speak up. Came up. Great. Now let's feel the fear. What is fear? It's going to be body sensations. It's going to be some stories. But like anything else in the world, it's going to pass. So that is exactly what you said, courageous allyship. That's how one builds courage, through practice, right? So that's why we need to start taking risks, because otherwise we're living in this limited sense of self. And if we are all living in our limited sense of selves as these individual islands, imagine how limited our world is. But yet, once we break these patterns and we break these biases, a lot of them being internalized biases too, then we can truly thrive and be more,
Yeah, I think you'll agree. And there's some Gallup studies that said that if we don't do this, some of the consequences, it's costing US companies literally billions of dollars. And so your work is, of course, important for these groups that feel marginalized. But it's important for US companies to understand that it is important for them too. And so that being said, I hear what you're saying about just kind of doing it and getting in there. But there are some real fears if you're part of a company or a corporation. There are some real risks. And so is there any, can you shed any light or give any advice on maybe how companies can set up structures that will support this happening, so that will make it more conducive to other people speaking up and making it more conducive to be able for employees to be able to execute some of the things that you teach in your course?
I think a lot of companies are doing it right now in light of the protests that have happened, in light of the disparities we're seeing around COVID. I think the way most people are succeeding, most companies succeeding around this is actually the leadership, sending out an email to every single person being like, hey, we're committed to this. Black Lives Matter. We do not stand for sexual harassment in the workplace. Actually first owning that, and then, basically advising a committee of individuals that are, basically not just, they're charged with creating a pathway to instill education as well as conversation around this within companies. So I think I want to commend a lot of those companies that are already doing this work. And if they're not, there are ways that individual employees who feel like this is something that's important to them, they could use their persuasive authority, using, again, compassion as their tool. So not being abrasive, not because like when we say when we're part of a call out culture, we're basically inducing shame in other people. And shame is an afflictive emotion, prevents behavior change, prevents people from coming in. So what we want to do, instead of calling out people, we want to call them in, and then use that privilege of authority to then be like, hey, we need to make a statement. We want to do continued education on this. We want to talk about this. And the thing is, once people talk about it, you realize that you're not the only person who wants to talk about it. And that once people have talked about it, it's kind of like this burden that's been taken off of people. So now they can focus their energies on collaboration and innovation, creativity, and actually doing the task at hand. So performance goes up tremendously. So it's totally a win-win-win.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And of course, we have to talk a moment about mindset, because that is something that I'm like obviously incredibly passionate about. And I want to say piggybacking or really emphasizing what you just said, preparing your mindset prior to some of these crucial conversations is so important. And there's something, you know, that I talk about in my curriculum called an eco mindset, ECO. And it's just doing similar to what you were talking about prior to going into any crucial conversation, developing empathy. In other words, have I taken a moment to think about what it might be like for the other person? And then developing curiosity. I'm curious what it might actually be like for that person. And then also being optimistic. Because a lot of times, and you've probably seen this too, is that if we've had past failures or if we're trying to go into something new, then it's really difficult, because now we're acting on past experiences rather than being optimistic and looking forward to what could be. So we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit before we get started. So what do you think about doing the pre-work prior to having these important conversations?
I think it's important. I think part of it is like people, like we can rely on other people. We don't have to do it on our own. So all of those things that you said, empathy, optimism, curiosity, it's not something that I can do just sitting by myself in my room, but it's actually through discussions. So finding that friend at work, finding that colleague with whom you could actually share these things, and you can cultivate this together. And it's funny that you mentioned these things. These are the competencies that we're helping people develop through our work. Optimism, curiosity, empathy and compassion, skillful communication. And these are things, again, these aren't something that we can just think up. These are part of emotional intelligence, right? So just as we learned, like just as I was trained to become a lawyer or a scientist, we can train ourselves in these skills. And that does require commitment. It requires a commitment, yet the benefits of that are just manifold, like so much greater than the commitment that's gone within. You know, in terms of addressing issues around burnout and stress and depression and loneliness, which is the biggest epidemics that we're facing in our world, particularly in light of COVID. So it's really, really about kind of really building skills to really be a fully fledged human being.
Yeah, which of course I'm going to reiterate again is beneficial for everyone, not just the person themselves. So Anu, can you summarize it up for people that are watching, the three or four things that you're like, I want you to remember this, I want you to practice this, and these couple things that will really help us kind of move the needle and nudge our community and the world towards a better space?
Absolutely. I think the first thing that I'd say is really listen. So really being able to listen to different perspectives, even if you disagree with it, like just listening and then noticing what's happening in the body, especially if you disagree, investigate that comfort, because something about that discomfort is your body telling you your personal illness. And that's where the wound is. That's where it hurts. So that is great information, because once you listen, investigate the discomfort, then you can heal. And I think that's all I'll say for now, because that is the beginning of breaking bias, because we have somatically felt what that feels like. And we've somatically begun to redress it. And the last thing I would say is that if it's too hard, that's when we practice self-compassion. It's so important to do that. And it's not just like, well, I'm going to have compassion for myself. It's actually sitting down and either writing down or meditating, repeating loving phrases to oneself. And you'll be surprised to know it's like so hard for so many people to do that, because there's so many judgments we have about ourselves in our minds. There's so many things that we dislike about ourselves. So this is an opportunity to really be like, hey, regardless, this life right here is the closest life that I'll ever know.
Mhm.
And I have to care for it, I have to tend to it. And that's how we begin the work of breaking bias. We have to start with ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. You're preaching to the choir right now. I agree 100%. I love everything that you said. Listen, investigate, heal, compassion for others, especially compassion for ourselves. And I want to really emphasize the last thing that you said, and that compassion for ourselves when you actually have to do something. Because when we talk about, when we talk about our self-talk, our voice is the voice that we pay attention to the most because we've been hearing it the longest. So it's so powerful to say out loud what you have compassion for yourself for, to hear yourself or to see your own written word. So that is such a kind of small detail that's a little bit from a departure from just have self-compassion. I mean, when you say that, then we're not like, okay, like we don't really know what to do with it. So by just giving us that detail, it really gives us something that we can actually do and take action. And so I really appreciate all of these tips and tools. Now, you have a course out, is that right, that people can go through to actually have a process? Can you share that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have an hour-long course called Breaking Bias Online that folks can just log on to our website, bemorewithanu.com. And it's on a sliding scale. So we want to make this work accessible to as many people as possible. And we've condensed all the leading science into the 60 minutes to really give people just enough information they need to know to understand the nature of unconscious bias, its social and financial impacts, and then how to break them. And then for those interested in more of an intensive experience, we have a 4-week course called Breaking Racial Bias, which requires at least 4 hours of weekly commitments, about 16 hours over the course of 4 weeks, to really kind of, again, to learn those new habits and break racial bias for oneself. Yeah, moving forward.
I know what I'm going to be doing right after we get off this live interview. I'm going to be checking that out and enrolling. And I really want to honor you for the work that you've done. And thank you so much for your time. You're making a difference. And I think, with the communities and the momentum that you're building, it's going to elicit real change. And I'm really excited to be a part of it and also to spend some time with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure.
Okay, thanks so much. And also have a look at Anu's website. It's www.bemorewithanu.com. It's scrolling down there. So be sure to check it out. Check out his 1-hour course, 60 minutes. You can break it up to 4 chunks of 15 minutes. That's what I'm going to do. I can't wait to see it. Anu, thank you again. I look forward to
guys. So grateful.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.